The sound of heavy breathing echoed through Maple Grove's pristine sidewalks as 15-year-old David Martinez pushed himself forward, one painful step at a time. His oversized t-shirt clung to his sweating frame, and his sneakers pounded against the concrete in an uneven rhythm that spoke of determination rather than athletic grace. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of the exclusive housing development, where every blade of grass seemed perfectly positioned and every flower bed maintained to magazine standard perfection. David had been following this route for exactly 3 weeks now, ever since Dr. Richardson had sat him down in that sterile white office and delivered the news that would change everything. "Your weight is putting dangerous strain on your heart," she had said, her voice gentle but firm. "We need to start with moderate exercise. Nothing too intense. Just get moving. David, your life depends on it." The prescription was simple 30 minutes of walking or light jogging every morning before school. Simple, but not easy. The neighborhood around him radiated wealth and privilege. Million-dollar homes sat back from tree-lined streets, their windows gleaming like watching eyes. Mercedes and BMWs filled driveways behind wrought iron gates. David had never felt comfortable here. Even though his family had lived in their modest rental at the development's edge for 2 years. His father worked long hours at some corporate job David barely understood, and his mother cleaned houses in the richer sections of town. They were the invisible people in this world of visible prosperity. As David rounded the corner onto Sycamore Lane, his pace slowed even further. His chest burned, and sweat dripped steadily from his forehead despite the cool morning air. He paused, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. That's when he heard the golf cart approaching from behind, its electric motor whirring with mechanical precision. "Excuse me." The voice was sharp, authoritative, and unmistakably hostile. David straightened up, turning to see a woman in her 50s climbing out of a white golf cart emblazoned with HOA Patrol in bold red letters. She wore a crisp navy blazer over pressed khakis, and her graying hair was pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch her features into permanent disapproval. A badge glinted on her chest, and David could see handcuffs hanging from her utility belt. Karen Whitmore had been the Homeowners Association's chief enforcement officer for 7 years, a position she had lobbied for and defended with the ferocity of a territorial animal. She prided herself on maintaining the standards that kept Maple Grove the most prestigious address in the county. Property values were her religion, and any threat to the neighborhood's image was met with swift and uncompromising action. "You need to move along," Karen said, her voice cutting through the morning stillness like a knife. "You're blocking the sidewalk for legitimate residents who need to walk their dogs and go about their morning routines." David blinked, confusion replacing exhaustion on his face. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm just jogging. The sidewalk is public, right? I'm not blocking anyone." "Don't get smart with me." "Young man." Karen's eyes narrowed as she looked David up and down, taking in his obvious struggle with physical exertion. "Your pace is so slow it's practically loitering. Real joggers don't stop every 50 feet to catch their breath. This is a respectable neighborhood, not a place for—" She paused, letting her gaze linger on David's size. "Whatever this is supposed to be." The words hit David like physical blows. He had heard variations of this kind of cruelty before, but never from an adult in a position of authority. Never with such calculated malice. "I have a medical condition," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "My doctor said I need to exercise." "I don't care what some quack doctor told you," Karen snapped, pulling out a citation book from her belt. "What I care about is maintaining the quality of life in this community. Your presence here is disruptive and inappropriate. You're creating a public nuisance." David felt his world tilting. The sidewalk seemed to shift beneath his feet as the woman's words sank in. This couldn't be happening. He was just trying to get healthy, trying to follow his doctor's orders, trying to save his own life. "Please," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'll move faster. I promise. I just need to—" "You need to leave," Karen interrupted, her hand moving to the handcuffs on her belt. "And if you don't comply immediately, I'll have to take more serious action. This is your only warning." The threat hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. David looked around desperately, hoping to see another person, someone who might intervene, or at least witness what was happening. But the street was empty, except for the distant sound of a lawnmower and the gentle rustle of wind through perfectly trimmed hedges. "I don't understand," David said, his voice growing stronger with indignation. "I live here. My family pays rent. I have every right to use these sidewalks." Karen's face flushed red with anger. "Don't you dare raise your voice to me. I am a duly appointed officer of this community, and I will not tolerate disrespect from some overweight delinquent who thinks he can terrorize our residents." The word terrorize seemed to echo in the morning air, so absurdly out of proportion to reality that David almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. This woman wasn't just being mean. She was dangerous. "I'm not terrorizing anyone," David said, backing away slowly. "I'm just trying to exercise. And I'm trying to maintain order." Karen's voice rose to a shout as she advanced on him. "Do you have any idea how hard I work to keep this place pristine? Do you know what it takes to maintain property values in a market like this? And then, people like you come along, bringing down the whole neighborhood with your... She struggled for words, her face now purple with rage. David realized with growing horror that this woman had moved beyond rational thought into something much more dangerous. Her hand was on her handcuffs now, fingers working at the clasp. "Ma'am, please," David said, his voice shaking. "I'm just a kid. I'm not doing anything wrong." "Get on the ground!" Karen screamed, yanking the handcuffs free from her belt. "Get on the ground right now, or I'll call the police and have you arrested for resisting arrest." The absurdity of being arrested for resisting an arrest that hadn't happened yet was lost on David in his panic. All he could see was a middle-aged woman in a blazer advancing on him with handcuffs, her face twisted with an anger that seemed completely divorced from anything he had actually done. David turned to run, but his body betrayed him. 3 weeks of gradual conditioning wasn't enough to overcome 15 years of sedentary living. His legs, already weakened from his morning jog, gave out after just a few steps. He stumbled, caught himself, and then collapsed onto the sidewalk as his overworked cardiovascular system finally reached its limit. Karen was on him immediately, her knee pressing into his back as she fumbled with the handcuffs. "I told you to get down. This is what happens when you don't listen. This is what happens when you don't respect authority." David's face was pressed against the concrete, his cheeks scraping against the rough surface as he struggled to breathe. The weight of Karen's body on his back made it even harder to draw air into his already stressed lungs. "I can't breathe," he gasped. "Please, I can't breathe." "You should have thought of that before you decided to turn my neighborhood into your personal gym," Karen snarled, clicking one handcuff around David's wrist. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before bringing your problems into a respectable community." The sound of approaching footsteps on the sidewalk made both of them look up. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down, was walking her small terrier. She stopped dead when she saw the scene unfolding before her, her mouth falling open in shock. "Karen," she called out hesitantly, "what's going on? Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Margaret," Karen called back, not loosening her grip on David. Just dealing with a troublemaker who doesn't understand community standards. Mrs. Henderson moved closer, her terrier yapping anxiously at the end of its leash. But he's just a boy. Karen, what could he possibly have done? He was disrupting the peace, Karen said firmly, loitering on the sidewalk, blocking residents from using the walkways. When I asked him to move along, he became belligerent and resistant. David tried to speak, to explain what had really happened, but Karen's weight on his back made it difficult to form words. All that came out was a choked whisper. Just jogging. Mrs. Henderson's face crumpled with confusion and concern. Jogging, Karen. You can't arrest someone for jogging. That's not legal, is it? It is when they're creating a public disturbance, Karen insisted. But David could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. I have the authority to maintain order in this community, and that's exactly what I'm doing. More residents were beginning to emerge from their homes now, drawn by the commotion. David could hear voices, hushed conversations, the sounds of people gathering. His humiliation was complete. Not only was he being arrested for the crime of exercising while overweight, but now the entire neighborhood was going to witness his degradation. Karen, I think you should let him up, Mrs. Henderson said, her voice growing more assertive. This doesn't look right. This doesn't look right at all. I know what I'm doing, Karen snapped. But David felt her weight shift slightly. She was beginning to realize that her actions might not be as defensible as she had initially believed. That's when the black sedan pulled up to the curb. The car was expensive, European, the kind of vehicle that whispered rather than shouted about wealth. It stopped directly in front of the scene, and David heard the soft click of a door opening. Footsteps approached, measured and deliberate. What exactly is happening here? The voice was calm, controlled, but carried an undertone of authority that made everyone present turn their attention toward its source. David couldn't see the speaker from his position on the ground, but he could hear the immediate change in the atmosphere. The casual conversation stopped. Even Mrs. Henderson's terrier fell silent. Sir, this is HOA business, Karen said, but her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. I'm handling a disturbance. A disturbance. The man's voice was closer now, and David could see expensive leather shoes step into his field of vision. It looks to me like you have a child handcuffed on the sidewalk. I'm curious about what kind of disturbance would require that level of force. Karen finally climbed off David's back, though she kept one hand on the handcuffs. David was able to turn his head and see his unexpected advocate. The man was in his 40s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit, despite the early morning hour. His hair was silver at the temples, and his eyes held the kind of steady intelligence that suggested he was accustomed to being taken seriously. The boy was loitering, Karen said, her voice defensive, blocking the sidewalk, creating a nuisance. When I asked him to move along, he became aggressive and non-compliant. The man looked down at David, who was still lying face down on the concrete, with one wrist cuffed behind his back. Does that seem accurate to you, son? David managed to lift his head slightly. I was just jogging, he said, his voice hoarse from the stress and physical exertion. My doctor said I need to exercise. I wasn't blocking anyone or being aggressive. I was just trying to catch my breath. The man nodded slowly, then turned his attention back to Karen. And your response to a child trying to follow his doctor's orders was to handcuff him on the sidewalk. He was being disrespectful. Karen's voice was rising again, but now it carried a note of desperation rather than authority. He was arguing with me, questioning my authority. Your authority. The man's eyebrows rose slightly. And what exactly is the source of your authority to arrest children for exercising? Karen fumbled for her badge, holding it up like a talisman. I'm the HOA enforcement officer. I have the right to maintain order and protect property values. I see. The man examined the badge with the kind of attention usually reserved for interesting insects. And who exactly gave you the authority to use physical restraints on minors? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times. But no sound came out. The gathering crowd of neighbors began to murmur among themselves, and David could hear the shift in their tone. What had started as curious observation was becoming something else entirely. The HOA charter gives me broad discretionary powers to, Karen began. But the man cut her off with a raised hand. The HOA charter, he said slowly, gives you the power to issue citations for covenant violations. It gives you the power to report genuine crimes to actual law enforcement. It does not give you the power to physically restrain anyone, much less a child whose only crime appears to be exercising in public. David felt the handcuff around his wrist loosen slightly. Karen's certainty was crumbling under the steady pressure of logical questioning, and her grip on both her authority and her prisoner was weakening. Now, the man continued, his voice still perfectly calm. I think you should remove those handcuffs and allow this young man to continue his exercise routine. Don't you? Karen looked around desperately, seeking support from the gathered neighbors. But the faces looking back at her were not friendly. Mrs. Henderson was shaking her head in disgust. Other residents were pulling out their phones, and David realized with a mixture of relief and mortification that this entire incident was probably being recorded from multiple angles. Fine, Karen said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She fumbled with the handcuff key, her hands shaking with either anger or fear. But this isn't over. I'll be filing a report about this incident, and the HOA board will hear about this boy's disruptive behavior. The man smiled, and there was something in that expression that made David's pulse quicken with anticipation rather than fear. Oh, I think you're absolutely right, he said. The HOA board will definitely be hearing about this incident. In fact, I can guarantee it. Karen finished removing the handcuff and stepped back, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. David slowly pushed himself up from the sidewalk, wincing as blood returned to his compressed limbs. His cheek was scraped and bleeding, and his shirt was torn from the concrete. Are you all right, son? The man asked, extending a hand to help David to his feet. I think so, David said, accepting the assistance gratefully. Thank you for standing up for me. I don't even know who you are. The man's smile widened. My name is Richard Martinez, he said, and I think it's time we had a conversation about what just happened here. The name hit David like a physical blow. Martinez, his father's surname. But that was impossible. His father was at work, in his office downtown, dealing with corporate spreadsheets and business meetings. His father didn't drive expensive sedans or wear $1,000 suits or speak with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to command. Martinez, David repeated weakly. But you can't be. Hello, David, his father said quietly. I think we need to talk. The gathered crowd fell completely silent. Even Karen seemed to sense that something fundamental had just shifted in the dynamic of the situation. David stared at his father in complete bewilderment, trying to reconcile this elegant, powerful stranger with the tired man who left for work every morning in wrinkled khakis and discount dress shirts. I don't understand, David said. Dad, what are you doing here? Why are you dressed like... Like, like someone who owns the company that developed this entire subdivision, Richard asked gently. Like someone who holds the mortgage on every house in Maple Grove. Like someone who has been very carefully monitoring the activities of his HOA enforcement officer. Karen made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. The implications of what she was hearing were beginning to penetrate her shock, and David could see the color draining from her face. You see, Richard continued, his voice carrying easily to every member of the growing crowd. I've been receiving reports about certain irregularities in the enforcement of our community standards. Complaints about harassment, about selective enforcement, about a certain officer who seemed to be more interested in personal power than community service. He turned to face Karen directly, and his expression hardened. But I never imagined that those complaints would escalate to the point where I would find my own son handcuffed on the sidewalk for the crime of following his doctor's orders. Karen's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Her hands trembled as she tried to process the magnitude of her mistake. This wasn't just any overweight teenager she had decided to humiliate. This was the son of the man who literally owned her job, her authority, and quite possibly her future. "Mr. Martinez," she began, her voice cracking with desperation. "I had no idea. If I had known—" "If you had known what?" Richard interrupted, his voice sharp with controlled anger. "If you had known that this particular child was important to someone with power, you would have treated him with respect. What about all the other children you've harassed? What about all the other residents you've bullied? Did they deserve less consideration because their parents don't happen to own the development?" The question struck home with devastating accuracy. David could see several neighbors nodding in agreement, and he realized that his experience was not unique. Karen had been abusing her position for years, targeting anyone she perceived as vulnerable or different. "I was just doing my job," Karen said weakly, "maintaining standards, protecting property values." "Your job," Richard said coldly, "was to serve this community, to help resolve disputes, to maintain common areas, to ensure that residents could enjoy their homes in peace. Your job was not to terrorize children for being overweight, or to handcuff teenagers for exercising." He pulled out his phone, and David could see him scrolling through what looked like a long list of messages. "I have 14 formal complaints about your conduct filed in the past 6 months alone. Harassment of the Chen family for planting non-approved flowers in their garden. Threatening the Johnsons with fines for allowing their 8-year-old daughter to play hopscotch on the sidewalk. Issuing citations to elderly residents for walking too slowly on community paths." Each item on the list hit Karen like a physical blow. Her earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing understanding of just how precarious her position had become. "And now this," Richard continued, gesturing toward David's scraped face and torn shirt. "Physically restraining a minor for the crime of exercising in public? I think it's safe to say that your interpretation of community standards has diverged significantly from the values we actually want to promote in Maple Grove." Karen looked around desperately, seeking some escape from the judgment she could see in every face around her. But there was no refuge to be found. The neighbors who had once deferred to her authority were now looking at her with disgust and contempt. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can change. I can do better. This was just a misunderstanding." Richard considered this for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but implacable. "Karen, I don't think you understand the severity of what just happened here. You physically assaulted a minor. You violated his civil rights. You abused your position of authority in the most egregious way possible." He turned to address the gathered crowd. "I want everyone here to understand something important. This incident is not representative of the values we want to promote in our community. Maple Grove was designed to be a place where families can thrive, where children can play and exercise safely, where neighbors look out for each other regardless of their background or circumstances. The neighbors murmured their agreement, and David felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. Therefore, Richard continued, I am calling an emergency meeting of the HOA board for this evening at 7 o'clock in the community center. All residents are invited to attend. We will be discussing not only this incident, but also a comprehensive review of our enforcement policies and procedures. Karen seemed to shrink into herself as she realized what was coming. An emergency board meeting meant a formal review of her conduct. It meant testimony from residents, documentation of complaints, and almost certainly the end of her reign as the neighborhood's self-appointed tyrant. In the meantime, Richard said, turning back to Karen, you are suspended from all enforcement activities pending the outcome of tonight's meeting. You will surrender your badge, your handcuffs, and your golf cart immediately. You can't do that, Karen protested, but her voice lacked conviction. The board has to vote on personnel decisions. Actually, Richard said with a slight smile, as the primary stakeholder in this development and the chairman of the board, I can suspend you for cause pending a formal hearing, and physically restraining a minor without justification certainly qualifies as cause. The revelation that David's father was not just a property owner, but the chairman of the HOA board, sent another ripple of shock through the assembled crowd. David himself felt like he was living in some kind of alternate reality, where his quiet, unassuming father had transformed into a corporate titan. Karen slowly removed her badge and handed it over, her movements mechanical and defeated. The handcuffs followed, clinking softly as they transferred from her belt to Richard's outstretched hand. Finally, she climbed into the golf cart that had been her symbol of authority and drove away, leaving behind a wake of uncomfortable silence. The crowd began to disperse, neighbors returning to their homes with plenty to discuss over their morning coffee. But several residents approached David and his father before leaving, offering words of support and apology for what had happened. Mrs. Henderson was among the last to leave. She paused in front of David, her elderly face creased with concern. I'm so sorry, dear, she said quietly. If I had known she was capable of something like this, I would have spoken up sooner. It's okay, David said, though he was still struggling to process everything that had happened. Thank you for trying to help. After the last neighbor had departed, David found himself alone with his father on the sidewalk, where his ordeal had begun. The morning sun was higher now, warming the air and casting shorter shadows across the manicured landscape. Dad, David said finally, his voice small and confused. I don't understand. How are you? Who are you? Really? Richard sighed, and, for the first time that morning, he looked like the tired father David recognized. I'm the same person I've always been, son. I just haven't been entirely honest about what I do for a living. They walked slowly back toward their house, David's exercise routine forgotten in the wake of more pressing concerns. Richard explained how he had built his real estate development company from nothing, how success had brought wealth and responsibility in equal measure, and how he had chosen to keep his professional life separate from his family life, to protect them from the complications that came with money and power. I wanted you and your mother to have normal lives, he said. I didn't want you to grow up thinking that money solved every problem, or that you were better than other people because of what I did. David absorbed this information slowly, trying to reconcile it with everything he thought he knew about his family. "But Mom cleans houses," he said. "Why would she do that if we don't need the money?" "Because she wants to," Richard replied. "Because work gives her purpose and independence. Because she's proud of taking care of herself and contributing to our family. I would never ask her to give that up just because I happen to make more money." They reached their modest rental house, and David looked at it with new eyes. It wasn't modest because they couldn't afford better. It was modest because his parents had chosen simplicity over ostentation, substance over appearance. That evening, the community center was packed beyond capacity. Word of the morning's incident had spread throughout Maple Grove like wildfire, and it seemed like every resident in the development wanted to witness Karen's reckoning. The formal hearing was devastating for Karen's credibility. Resident after resident stood up to testify about harassment, intimidation, and abuse of power. The Chen family described being threatened with fines for planting roses instead of the approved marigolds. The Johnsons told of their daughter being made to cry by Karen's aggressive enforcement of playground rules. Elderly residents spoke of being bullied for walking too slowly or sitting too long on community benches. Through it all, Karen sat slumped in her chair. Her earlier defiance completely evaporated. The weight of her actions, accumulated over years of unchecked authority, had finally caught up with her. When it came time for her to speak in her own defense, she could offer nothing but weak excuses and hollow apologies. "I was just trying to maintain standards," she repeated over and over, as if the phrase were a magic incantation that could somehow justify years of cruelty. The board's vote was unanimous, immediate termination, forfeiture of all HOA benefits, and a recommendation that the community pursue legal action for her assault on David. But Richard had one more surprise in store. "Actually," he said, standing up as the meeting was winding down, "I've decided to take a more direct approach to ensuring this kind of abuse never happens again." He looked around the packed room, making eye contact with as many residents as possible. "Effective immediately, I'm dissolving the current HOA enforcement structure. Instead of having one person with broad discretionary powers, we'll be establishing a community council with rotating membership and strict oversight procedures." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. Several residents stood up to volunteer for the new council, eager to help create a more just and equitable system. "Furthermore," Richard continued, "I'm establishing a community fund to support residents who want to pursue healthy activities like exercise, gardening, or recreational sports. Our sidewalks and common areas are meant to be used, not just admired." David felt tears prick at his eyes as he realized what his father was doing. The morning's humiliation was being transformed into something positive, a catalyst for real change that would benefit everyone in the community. In the weeks that followed, Karen's story became a cautionary tale that spread far beyond Maple Grove. Security camera footage of the incident went viral on social media, accompanied by discussions about class discrimination, abuse of authority, and the treatment of overweight individuals in public spaces. Karen herself faced both civil and criminal charges. The district attorney, responding to public pressure and the clear evidence of assault, filed charges for unlawful restraint and violation of civil rights. The civil suit brought by David's family resulted in a substantial settlement that was donated to organizations promoting body positivity and exercise accessibility for young people. Most importantly for David, the incident marked a turning point in his relationship with his community and his own self-image. No longer was he the invisible, struggling kid on the periphery of Maple Grove's social structure. He was a symbol of resilience and a reminder that everyone deserved respect, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. His exercise routine continued, but now he was often joined by other residents who had been inspired by his courage and determination. Mrs. Henderson became a regular walking companion, along with several other neighbors who had decided that community support was more important than individual achievement. The morning jogs that had once been a source of shame and struggle became opportunities for connection and mutual encouragement. David's pace gradually improved, but more importantly, his confidence soared. He learned that strength came not from being perfect, but from refusing to give up in the face of adversity. 6 months after the incident, David had lost 40 pounds and gained something far more valuable, a sense of belonging and self-worth that no amount of harassment could diminish. The sidewalks of Maple Grove, once a source of fear and humiliation, had become pathways to a better life. And every morning, as he laced up his sneakers and stepped out into the dawn light, David remembered the lesson his father had taught him through both words and actions, that true authority comes not from the power to control others, but from the courage to stand up for what is right, regardless of the personal cost. The weight of justice, he had learned, was far more powerful than the weight of prejudice. And in the end, justice always won.